You got it. Hello, everybody.
Hello, everyone. We're going to be doing a session on OpenStack and GDPR. I'd like to introduce Doug Soltes, who's our Director of Product.
And this is Jim Little. He's our CEO and a co-founder at Storage Made Easy. Now, if you're here in the crowd, you probably want to know what Storage Made Easy does. Storage Made Easy provides a file fabric. Whoop, one too many slides. There we go. So what is a file fabric? So a file fabric is a system that's going to connect all of your storage. So that storage can be in the cloud, whether that's Azure, Google, Office 365. It can be legacy protocols like FTP, email servers, and whatnot. Or, since we're at OpenStack, it can be your on-premise or your cloud Ceph. It can be your OpenStack deployment from partners, like one of our partners is right here, Memset. So it doesn't matter where that storage is, we're going to give you a single pane of glass into that storage. You're going to be able to use that storage from any device. So we're going to encrypt that data in flight using a RESTful API, just like you're used to using with OpenStack today. And we're going to do other unique things like data governance and compliance, which is pretty much the subject of this talk. We do things like acceleration of that content. So if you've got a whole bunch of data sitting in Ceph and you want to move it to your local filer, you just tell it through the GUI, move this data from A to B, and it's going to do content level acceleration no matter which direction we're pointing that in, or no matter which protocols we're talking about. So maybe you've got data in Dropbox that you want to pull back into your Ceph cluster because your Dropbox user shouldn't have shared that data in the first place. We're going to handle it all. But the main purpose of this talk is around GDPR. GDPR is, in some ways, the bear in the room. And so, Jim, maybe you could tell us a little bit more.
Sure. So, for those of you who don't know, GDPR becomes law this Friday. So by the time you get home from OpenStack, GDPR will be law. How many people here have done any GDPR initiatives within their company? Any? Oh, quite a few. Okay. So we've, at Storage Made Easy, we're a UK company, even though we've got presence in the US. And just like every other European UK company, we've had to do a lot of work on internal process on GDPR. And there's a lot of people in my company who feel like that bear, I can tell you. So GDPR stands for the General Data Protection Regulation. And it's essentially an upgrade of previous data protection policy. And the reason that policy is being upgraded is primarily to do with digital data. The digital data and the way that we work with digital media and personal information through websites has accelerated within the last 10 years dramatically. And the existing protections that are in place for personal data are no longer deemed adequate for protecting that data or for providing transparency. So a lot of you probably know about this already because you'll have seen some of the things that have happened with Facebook and with Cambridge Analytics and what happened to personal data and how people were targeted. And the idea around the General Data Protection Regulation is to put the power of your personal data back in your hands. So there's a lot of tenets of GDPR. These are some of them. I won't go through them one by one, but the main premise is to allow data that you give to a service provider or you give to a company to be treated lawfully, to be processed lawfully, and to allow you to delete it when it's no longer needed, and also to give you more granular access to how it's used. So just because you sign up for something doesn't mean that you want to receive marketing from companies you never signed up with. So you should be able to opt in or opt out on the way in. Some of those provisions are all around what you'll see in GDPR. Now, one of the things around GDPR is around a breach, for example. So a lot of you will have seen a lot of the high-profile breaches that have occurred. They sort of occur every week in some cases. And sometimes you'll see, like the Yahoo one, it took almost 2 years before Yahoo even admitted that there was a breach had taken place. In case of the GDPR, there are provisions in law now where a service provider has to tell you within 72 hours if they've been breached and somebody's accessed your personal data. Did we mention the fines? There are some horrendous fines with GDPR. The maximum penalty for breach, the maximum penalty is 20 million euro or 4% of gross turnover worldwide. So not net turnover, but gross turnover. So obviously, these type of fines can have a big effect on any company, particularly some of the smaller companies like charities who actually don't make any money and their turnover is not what they do for profit. So I've heard a couple of times since I've been at the show that because we're not in the EU, it doesn't affect me. So if you're processing data that is for EU residents and you store that data, it doesn't matter where you are in the world. You'll still be affected by the GDPR. And I think the way that the world is today, I think everybody processes data from everywhere. And to give you a little bit of an example like that, we, as well as having an on-premise enterprise service, we run our own SaaS service. And actually our SaaS service is split between the US and the EU. So you can sign up in the EU or you can sign up in the US. And we've had that for a few years. But when we did an audit of our US service, we found that 5% of all the people in our US service were EU citizens. So we've had to go and offer those guys the ability to migrate across to our EU service. And I think that's probably the tip of the iceberg in terms of who's storing personal data. So I want to talk a little bit about object storage and how that can help with GDPR. One of the main tenets of the GDPR is this concept of privacy by design. So designing your service up front to accommodate the privacy requirements that are now enshrined in law. And object storage is a good fit for that. In fact, the way it stores objects is a good fit for that, because a big tenet is security, and every time you commit an object to object storage, it's immutable. You get an MD5 hash, you know that object's not been tampered with. If you want to update that object, you actually are writing a new object with a new MD5 hash, and you have security around that. So the very basis of object storage has some of those provisions built in. Obviously, GDPR is going to have an effect on the way that companies store their data today, because of some of the things they have to do to that data as per the GDPR law. So one of those things that I think will be affected is how companies store data, particularly on tape. Because when you have to go back through the tape and start to either look for data because you get a subject access request, or delete data because somebody tells you that they want all their data to be deleted, as is their right under the GDPR, tape is not really going to cut it. And we are already starting to see companies migrating some of their tape infrastructure across to object. Of course, data retention and expiration becomes even more prevalent under the GDPR, because if somebody says, I want my data to be deleted, how are you going to do that? And actually, with object storage policies, you've got some great tools already built into the object storage to allow you to handle that very elegantly. Logging becomes really important, because when you get served with a subject access request, you're going to need to be able to tell the end user who's had access to the data, i.e. the object. And again, you get that for free within the infrastructure of object storage. The data flow and locality becomes really important. Because of the way that the law is written, any transfers of data outside of the European Union has to be done in a way that is applicable with the law, which means that there's got to be a transfer provision set up with any third-party countries outside of the EU. So being able to control how data is transferred, again, can be done fairly easily with policies within object storage. You also want to restrict data transfers, the alternative of making it happen. And again, you can do that quite elegantly with policies. And lastly, object storage comes built in with multi-tenancy. So you can segregate user data and make that user data private to each other, which again is part of this privacy by design, best effort. So the bottom line is OpenStack and object storage is well suited to fulfilling the concepts of the GDPR and this principle of privacy by design. And we're starting to see, certainly our company is starting to see, that a lot of companies are looking to build upon object storage to satisfy some of the things they have to do for GDPR.
So then if I can give you guys a quick demo in a minute and show you how the file fabric can help. I just want to hit on some of the key tenets that the file fabric is going to show in that demo. So the first one is we can discover your data. So if you have an existing bucket on your Ceph, or you have a container in Swift, or you've got a file share in SIFs, wherever that data is, we're going to go in, we're going to find that data, and we're going to classify it. And that classification is pretty intelligent. So we have a police type of system where we're able to define policies for that data that we discover, and we're able to say things like, well, if you see this type of regex string or this type of information, whether that be an email address around PII for GDPR, or whether it be a credit card number, and we're talking about PCI DSS, or different standards to protect your data, we're going to be able to auto-classify the data that we discover. And again, it's not just the file name, it's the content within the data. Now, when you go to access that data, we want to identify who's accessing it. So we're going to tie into AD, LDAP, SAML, whatever authentication system that you use to verify the user. In fact, we even have on some devices biometric authentication and 2FA. Now, once we've got you access to this, we want to know who touched the data, what they did with the data, what IP address they came from. Again, these are tenets in GDPR that we need to audit and find out any time your piece of data has been accessed. And then everything needs to be encrypted. We need to have encryption by default. And a lot of people go, well, my data's already in S3, it's already encrypted. We've seen in the past that that's not what GDPR would call a best effort. So a best effort is not, well, I put it in Amazon and I picked the little checkbox for server-side encryption. It's that I'm using a key management system, or I'm using SSEC, which, by the way, you can now use in Ceph Luminos, right? That's an advanced API call where you say, anytime my data lands in Ceph, not only does it have to be encrypted at rest, but when I go to retrieve that data, I also must submit a key in order to use it. And so without further ado, I'd like to give you guys a quick demo of how the file fabric can do this deep content search and indexing around a PII-based use case. So I am currently, there we go, looking in our system, and I have two types of storage. I have a Ceph Luminos cluster. I also have my SIFs file. Again, single pane of glass. I'm able to see all of my files, containers, and whatnot. Now I have a number of different folders, and some of these, like the finance folder, are labeled with this little label here that says, in fact, why don't I make that a little bigger? It says PII. Why? Because some of the data that I've put into this system have been identified as having PII information in it. In fact, if I click this credit card information file, I can see in this window, or why don't we pull it up in a full window, I can see that it's actually full of credit card information. I've also automatically tagged this data. So if I go and look at my tags, I can see that it's PII, and I've self-identified it as being credit card information. Whereas other information I have out there may have something like social security numbers in it. Let's see, this one has both social security and credit card information. I can access those tags through a quick search, where I've defined that I want to look at the PII tags, any files with social security numbers. Say I don't happen to have any in my system right now, but French social security numbers, US social security numbers. Now, let's say I'm a user and I'm not supposed to put any PII information into this folder. Well, I happen to have some PII information here. I've got this employee data file. If I'm looking at it, it's full of social security numbers. So let's just go ahead and click and drag that into the wrong folder. Now what you're going to see is that, again, through a web UI, we're going to do that upload, just like if you use other file fabrics out there in the world. We can also do this through Mac clients, Windows clients, Linux, Android, iOS, you name it. But the files in there, it's now been deep content searched, and I can see that my folder has been tagged PII, my actual file has been tagged PII, and a warning's gone out to anybody using this directory that there's PII information in it. In a minute, I'll also, or maybe if I do a refresh of my screen, there we go. I got a little message pop up letting me know that there's PII information in there. And we have a role in the system. If you're the GDPR reviewer for your company, you can get these messages, or you can get them via email. Because what's important is to ensure that the access to PII-based information is controlled and contained. And again, the system allows you to write your own PII-based detection, or choose from over 50 different open sourced PII libraries that we've got a repo out there in GitHub. All right, So I've got the data in here, I've identified it as PII, and then the last thing that I want to bring up was the deep content search. So let's say I probably should have cleared my results from before I rehearsed. All right, so let's look for, your traditional search looks something like this. I'm in the system, and I'm looking for any file called, credit. And if I search that, sorry. If I search that, I find, these two files. But again, what we want is deep content search. So maybe I'm looking for any file that has the word Visa in it. Well, I can find that I've got these two files that actually have the word Visa in them. I can find where it is. I can, again, display it full screen. So in a nutshell, what we're giving you the ability to do is to take any type of data, Swift, Ceph, NetApp, you name it, index it, find the relevant information to GDPR, alert the proper GDPR reviewer, allow them to take action on that data to ensure that you have now done best effort to protect somebody's data, or delete it if need be. And so with that, I think I'll hand it back to Jim.
So the bottom line is that the combination of object storage together with our product, the File Fabric, can help protect existing data and enforce GDPR policies on new data. We've done quite a lot of work on that. We've worked with quite a lot of companies now to help them get their GDPR compliance in place. And as Doug mentioned, in terms of the work we've done around that content search and identifying GDPR, all of the expressions that we've open sourced. We have buy-in already from some of the service providers we work with in the different countries to when they identify new expressions for their country, they're going to upload it to that open source repository so that everybody can take advantage of it. And bottom line is our booth is just there. If you have any questions on GDPR or indeed on our product, by all means come across and
come by. Even if you just say, hey, listen, I have a different system than yours. Where is that library that you're talking about of open source code? We're glad to give you a reference to it so that you can feed that into another system and or contribute to it.
Sure. On that note, we'd like to say thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.